makers, and practitioners. I am honored to introduce today's BIOMES speaker, Dr. Julian Silverman, an assistant professor in science and mathematics at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City, New York. Dr. Silverman is a researcher, life cycle practitioner, and community advocate driven to reduce petroleum dependence in fragrances, cosmetics, dyes, and paints. Beyond his experimental work, he partners with experts across the chemical education community to develop open access curricular materials and assessments for students and educators to contextualize chemistry and environmental science. He also teaches multiple interdisciplinary courses at FIT surrounding climate change, materials toxicology, and fragrance chemistry. Dr. Silverman provides a creative blend of chemical expertise and artistry often lost within the general scientific community. He constantly pushes for greater collaboration between sciences and the arts as a method of tackling wicked environmental problems. I'm especially excited to introduce Dr. Silverman, not only due to personal academic interests, but also as a participating member of CBA's Moving the Needle discussion group on sustainable fashion. I've observed immense growth and demand for these discussions here at YSE. So it's thrilling that these important topics will get an even wider audience here today. Today's talk will focus on how waste products, such as lignin and spent oil, can transform the next generation of soft materials. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Silverman to the stage.
Thank you, Dylan. Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different things, but I wanted to introduce our two vocab words of the day, which are silage and sillage, very different words from very different places. Silage is going to represent essentially fermenting waste, generally found in agricultural settings, and sillage is generally going to be the wake of scent following a person. That could be bad scent. It could also be the perfume leaving someone as you're walking behind them in the subway, as I experience every day. And kind of in between, we're going to talk about a variety of specialty chemicals, so essentially the active ingredients in the products we know and love. And so we have three stories to tell today, but first, just a little bit of introduction. Again, specialty chemicals are going to be functional and active ingredients. Examples include things like the plasticizers found in our plastics, and also different pigments found in a variety of products from cosmetics, like the nail polishes we see here. And so even though part of my goal is to sort of renovate the unsustainable products that we know and love and use every day, a new material is sort of the forefront of where sustainable cosmetics is. A new material uses things like chitosan and water-based formulations, along with vanillin, again, a natural product, to essentially create a low VOC and kid-friendly product that you could use in really any setting. And so even though I won't speak specifically about nail polish in detail, these are the kinds of chemicals we're going to talk about. A little bit different than what we might consider platform chemicals, which you then further transform before you use. And so let's talk a little bit about how we design safe and functional consumer and cosmetic products. So this is not my idea. This I'm borrowing from Vitruvius, who was by trade an architect. But generally, he thought that there were three areas that converge to create good design. What he called venustas, which was beauty, utilitas, which is its utility, and then also its firmitas, which means that it is firm and durable. Now, I have to admit, I am not an architect, nor do I really work with harder condensed materials. I am really a soft materials designer, and so when I create things like soaps and cosmetic products, I generally think instead about essentially versatile aspects of materials. And so rather than something that's going to last forever, which I would hope you know is not what we try to do when we create sustainable materials, we're thinking about things that are, again, flexible, multi-purpose. So ingredients like vanillin, which could be a fragrance, or instead perhaps could be a plasticizer, again, in different consumer products. And so I'll hazard a moment to ask you, what's something that could actually incorporate all three of these elements? I would argue that there are some consumer products that, are both beautiful, useful, and versatile. I do think that an iPhone or cell phone is a good example. But one of my favorite soft material examples is good old soap. And so as I'll talk about in a moment, I teach non-scientists and engineers, mostly branding experts and marketing students. But one of the questions I ask all my students every day in class is, who here has used soap today? And they have to raise their hand, right? And also, who has used soap with a positive attitude, right? It sort of refreshes us in some sense. And so these are going to be the three stories we tell. We're going to talk a little bit about beautiful chemicals, useful chemicals, and also versatile chemicals. But I want to talk about not only how we reach these sort of sustainable goals, but also the principles we use to achieve them. So I would hope that no one here is unfamiliar with these images on the slides. Unfortunately, when I teach my students, usually I'm the first one to bring to them these ideas. Again, not only because they're not chemists and scientists, but also because they're young, right? They're really still learning. And so again, the UN SDGs are going to represent the goals we're hoping to achieve, and the principles are the way that we reach them. Yale is, of course, an expert not only in working with the green chemistry principles, but also the engineering principles. And so again, these are interdisciplinary despite the name that we see at the top. And so perhaps the most important thing that I tell my students at FIT is not that they need to achieve all 17 of these goals alone. I think we all understand that this is an interdisciplinary effort, something we need to do through collaboration. And so one thing I always say, especially if anybody in this room is new to these, is that you choose one that you're really passionate about, and that if all of us did that, right, we'd be able to work on them together. And so as we start to think about my research specifically, one of the questions I ask and answer is not why are we working with waste, but why would we waste biomass at all? And so again, biomass represents really all the kind of organic matter on Earth in different forms and shapes. And even in the apple we have here as an example, right, leaving aside the food portions, the nutritive stuff that we could eat and digest, we can think about taking, say, the leaves or the stems or even the seeds and processing them to essentially extract out materials like cellulose, chemicals from lignins, and then, of course, fuels, perhaps from oils. This has been done in many different ways across different sectors. You could think about creating sustainable jet fuels from, right, oils pressed from seeds. And cellulose has been used for centuries to create a variety of sustainable products. Now, of course, as I said, my goal is to work with waste in different ways, and that is a much more challenging thing to do when you're only a chemist and scientist. And so, of course, we need engineers and business experts as well. But with that said, this is something we need to do in this time, not only as we think about preventing waste and using waste, but in an era with a real lack of funding for the sciences. Ironically, waste is usually free. People will pay you to cart it away. And so again, my name is Julian Silverman. I'm here from the Fashion Institute. And so if you aren't aware, we are technically a community college, though we do offer master's programs across business and also the fine arts. We generally have two large schools of business and design. So even though I always thought of FIT as the kind of quirky fashionistas walking down 27th Street, we'll also find that there are very talented business students as well. We have about 8,000 students, and none of them are science majors. So my biggest challenge, of course, is in a single semester, having them work through the scientific method, understand sustainable ideas and concepts like systems thinking. But the good news is that everybody does take a science course. Now, of course, on day one, I always remind them I'm not here to turn them into scientists, though that is my secret goal. Instead, it's more about making sure that they feel comfortable when they work at a big company, walking down the hall so that they can talk with R&D and discuss future innovations. Now, one of my favorite things about FIT is that we have really fascinating programs like jewelry design, museum professions, things that I've always enjoyed, right, in my sort of personal life. I primarily teach in the cosmetics and fragrance marketing program, which is looking not only at branding and marketing, but things like packaging, and is really, in many ways, really closely aligned with science communication as well. From there, I've gotten to write and teach courses like chemistry for cosmetics. We actually teach a life cycle assessment course, which I will tell you, teaching marketing students, that is quite a challenge, but they really appreciate the quantitative aspects of what we do. And more recently, very relevant to this audience, we now have our first toxicology course, which of course, uses the resources of science in a different setting. And so I hope I don't need to tell anyone that fashion is closely linked to chemistry. In this case study from 2016, it was found that it takes about 15 different chemicals just to create a single pair of jeans. As a chemistry educator, I appreciate that we're not only looking at acids and bases, but oxidants and reductants, along with biomolecules as well. And so this includes things like sizing chemicals that are found in garments at the store, and then of course things done at the factory as well, right? Like the acid wash on your jeans. And so it's usually only a quick introduction where I have people realize that science and math at FIT is really at the heart of, right, how to make fashion more sustainable. And so a little bit about myself. My work primarily was looking, again, at sustainable materials very broadly. Now that I'm at the Fashion Institute, I primarily look at things like pigments, paints, inks, and dyes, like you can see here. Again, this is primarily from an educational focus, trying to have students understand how to make things more sustainable. But we have a lot of fun getting dirty in workshops, as you can see in the top right. This is something I'll talk about in a moment at the Center for Book Arts, where we were making iron gall inks from waste. And so I can't help but notice that we are in New Haven with the Beinecke just down the street. And so this is, of course, relevant not only to science and engineering, but different disciplines, as we'll discuss. And so today's menu, post our introduction, we're going to talk first about creating versatile polymers to create packaging materials. Next, we'll talk about beauty very broadly across disciplines. And then we will talk about how you could create functional inks with waste materials. And so we begin with an image that I see all too often in New York City, which is the image on the right. Very fitting that a lot of us are eating pizza as we're sitting here. Totally appropriate. This is something, right, that I've begun to question. As we look at this image, the first thing you notice is that we have some empty pizza boxes. Pizza boxes are notoriously difficult to recycle as they are usually stained with oils as well. And so we begin to ask, what do you see in this image? Is this waste? How could we transform this waste that we see? And as difficult as it could be to think about how we could repurpose these materials, cellulosic, oil-based, whatever it are, we'll also find that by looking into other disciplines, we're going to really be able to change our perspective and see this as a useful mine for different sorts of chemicals. So something I always do in all my talks is, that was just the introduction, so in case you need to run out now, if you're not interested, you can. But without further ado, let's talk a little bit about polymers. And so we're going to talk first a little bit about cellulose so that we can then talk about lignin. So at the Center for Book Arts, where I was a resident fellow for this past year, there was a wonderful book called Vicky Cobb's Paper Making Book. Can you raise your hand if you've ever made paper before? Pulped old recycled papers? Very nice. So the good news is this is something that you can do at home. It's also something you can do in a science lab at FIT with art students. In the center here, we had a project inspired by a student of mine who grew up in the Midwest, and again was really interested in repurposing corn fibers, essentially from the waste in agricultural settings. And so one of the things you can note is the beautiful variety of fibers and packaging materials we have here. My students created a mock-up of using these, again, for different other soft materials like soaps. And this was part of a Sustainability Council grant that really ended about a year ago, but grew out of a past interest in, again, this sort of lignocellulosic processing that we see as of a great interest when we think about the biorefinery, but also something that's been done really for over 100 years. So even though cellulose is really the beginning of this project for us, I do want to take a little step back and talk about where we get some of our natural and renewable resources from. So after doing my PhD in New York City, I made my way out to the University of Kansas and their Center for Environmentally Beneficial Catalysis. Other than a mouthful, it sort of perfectly describes the vast majority of the work they do. Not only do they do sort of more traditional heterogeneous and homogeneous catalysis, they do a lot of computational work to determine if things are actually more green and sustainable. But when I was doing my project there, I was sort of at the bottom of this cycle here, creating reactors to, again, kind of scale up the work that chemists do to make it more realizable. But I couldn't help but notice as I would take my weekend drives around Lawrence, Kansas, evidence that kind of everything old is new again. And so here we have in the bottom right a beautiful image of a tree that has made its way all the way through a silo, right? This kind of historic and then modern put together, this sort of idea of old is new. And that became one of my favorite things to find. But just past the silo that you see here could easily be the silage that I introduced early on, right? This big heap of materials. Silage is often used as feed for animals, so it's not completely waste, but you can also imagine the variety of different waste materials that we'll talk about. And so one of the most abundant biomaterials on Earth is known as lignin. I have actually chosen not to show you a model of lignin other than this minor one we see at the bottom, because it is incredibly complex. From a chemical perspective, there are not only different types of bonds, but different residues that conjugate together. And so I always like to call lignin nature's plastic in the sense that it was evolved to really protect, right, vascular plants in different structures. Today, what we find is that lignin is in almost all sort of plants, right? We can extract it before or after the cellulose we use for paper, before or after, right, the food that we eat as well. And so on the top left, you can see I am standing with the world's largest ball of twine. That's a hotly debated question as to whether this is the actual one. There's many different largest balls of twine. Over 2,700 pounds at the current moment, it actually has over a metric ton of lignin in it, right? So again, lignin is something found across a variety of different plants, and for the most part is seen as a waste material. Now, I know there's a lot of good work even being done on this campus, repurposing lignin in different ways. But from the chemist's perspective, we can see that there are these really valuable aromatic structures that we can selectively kind of prune and take off, and then hopefully reuse in different ways. As a materials chemist, I'll tell you, though, that the structure of the big ball is kind of replicated at the microscale or nanoscale. I couldn't help but notice that as we sort of remove lignin from natural settings, it generally tends to ball up because it's rather hydrophobic. And so I appreciate that everything is kind of balls all the way down. As again, as an educator and chemist showing students models of atoms, it's nice to see that the materials kind of show that as well. And so one of the things we wanted to do, especially with grass lignin, which is really abundant in the Midwest, is think about how we could selectively remove different aromatic groups. So again, there are many different fractionation ways to do this. One of the ways that we had been pioneering at the CEBC was using ozone. And so ozone, again, is a pollutant at the ground level. Of course, it helps protect us in the troposphere. But in this case, what we find is that ozone can selectively or regioselectively attack the alkene double bonds, highlighted here in the ferulic acid groups, and essentially prune off those really valuable aromatics. Now, this isn't going to break down the entire lignin structure, but I'll talk about why that would be in just a moment. I also want to apologize for any biologists or ecologists. I realize strawberries don't grow on bushes quite like this, but the analogy is that you can leave behind the macrostructure and again remove some of those small aromatic components. And for those of you interested in knowing what we were removing, those include small aromatics like vanillin and 4-hydroxybenzaldehyde. On the left, this is again a popular fragrance. If anybody has walked through the aisles of Ulta or Sephora in the past couple of years, you might know that vanillin and vanilla gourmand fragrances are very popular. A little too popular for my liking, but things change every 5 years or so. But also, if you are, again, a chemist or a materials chemist, you can't help but notice that these are essentially monomers, right? These are things you could create plastics from and polymers, and also conjugate in different ways. They really just represent a base level of chemical structure that you can then begin to have a lot of fun with. And so as I stepped into the lab during my postdoc, this was being done, right? They were taking grass lignin, and they were essentially in a stirred tank reactor pumping in ozone. One of the great things about ozone in a reactor like this is it essentially can be transformed back into regular molecular oxygen. So even though it can be hazardous at ground levels, you can, of course, break it back down. You get oxygen as a byproduct. You get these very valuable small aromatics. And this worked pretty well. Again, something I had to learn as a chemist working with engineers is that sometimes even just a % or 2 of yield is very valuable when you're thinking about waste. And so, of course, getting another % or 2 out of this lignin at first can make a process even more scalable and reliable. And so what I had to do, and this was perhaps the hardest thing I've ever done, is build a reactor myself. Again, even though I wasn't an engineer, we decided to use a spray-based reactor. So instead of a more traditional stirred tank reactor, we were spraying the lignin into a droplet, kind of like a shower head, and then into an ozone atmosphere. And what this allowed us to do was essentially better interface the ozone into the droplets, get it to the lignin quickly enough that we could selectively remove those aromatics, but not essentially burn or char the materials inside. Now, of course, the other things I have to point out is that oxidizing alkenes can be incredibly dangerous. You can create these unstable ozonide structures that we see here, which essentially can explode. And so one of the things that we found was that by using the acidic media, which helps us digest the lignins, we actually could really avoid this formation of the ozonides. And so it was good from a process safety standpoint, but also good from this sustainability perspective as well. And so even though this was where the project technically ended, I wanted to take it a little bit further. Again, as a materials chemist working with engineers, I wanted to make actual materials. Vanillin is a wonderful, useful platform chemical, specialty chemical in some cases. But what we did was really age old. In this case, we decided to make plastics. And I will highlight that even though using formaldehyde to make resins is not safe or sustainable, this was really just a first step. So taking these valuable aromatics from our lignin, we're able to make phenol formaldehyde resins. You could, of course, swap out the formaldehydes for furan or furfural-based, bio-based alternatives. But I couldn't help but notice that even though they look very different than those traditional Bakelite resins, which you may have seen in old stories about the origin of plastics, these lignin resins were actually very viable. So they create these kind of prepolymers, which you can then use to create resins for, again, packaging as glues, or even just as plastics themselves. The good news here is that even though the formaldehyde is just a small part, these are essentially partially bio-based as well. And so, as I mentioned, this is all about fitting things into larger systems. So it wasn't just about getting out valuable aromatics and leaving that waste behind. one of our goals after the ozonolysis was actually to bring in the bread and butter of CEBC, catalysis, to essentially further break down these lignin structures. And so after first targeting these carbon-carbon double bonds, you can break some of these carbon-oxygen bonds using zeolites in different forms. And then from there, use the soup of low and medium weight phenolics and macromolecular structures to create these kind of lignin resins. And so from this very small yield that we get, generally less than 50% of the aldehydes themselves, and then a little bit more by catalyzing the process, we're able to really recover more than 95% of this waste and use it not only to make specialty chemicals, but then also perhaps the packaging materials we use to box them up and ship them out. And for what it's worth, one of the things I do day to day is show students at FIT what these things look like at the small scale. My art students and design students love seeing what these things are under an electron microscope. And even though, we can see the balls in different shapes and forms, I appreciate that we go from our aromatic aldehydes being removed to these kind of ball structures to a real soup, really nothing in the middle that we could see. And then we really build them back up into these plastic structures we see on the bottom right. And so I would say right now the lignocellulosic model is continuing to evolve, cellulosic ethanol really hasn't proved out in the way that we would like. And so in the future, I'm intrigued to see, where lignin is removed. Will it be first or second? And I'm going to hope somebody will chat with me afterwards about that as well. And so I want to take a little turn and talk about beauty instead of versatility of lignin. And I want to take us down the street from FIT to the Center for Book Arts. So I am not an artist by trade, but I work with them every day. And so compared to, say, the mass market or trade publications that you can pick up in the airport bookstore, we also have what are known as artist books, which could be a single unique volume, or it could be multiple volumes of a zine or something like that. So artist books kind of live in the space between mass market publication and then unique art object. And so part of my work this past year at the Center for Book Arts, which includes the studio and gallery space that you see up top, was to figure out how we could have artists sort of purposefully plan their art materials to be more sustainable. And so as I began to explore how waste is discovered across artist books, it was no surprise to see that they're already thinking about this. In this kind of very cheeky exploration of garbage and waste, you can see in the top left that this was part of a zine that I was looking at in their collections. And the joke is that you'll edit out this garbage in the front, and then the garbage is still there. I don't know if you feel that way. We have recycling bins all across FIT. I look in the recycling bins, and all we find is waste in them, instead of recycling. And so in this project, what we tried to explore was waste not only as content in art, as things being photographed, but also as sort of the inevitable outcome for art. One of the biggest challenges in museum professions is not only constantly storing materials, but the sort of systems thinking aspect of also deaccessioning and getting rid of materials when we're done with them. Now, if anybody else is a kind of mini hoarder like me, the last thing I do is give books away. And yet at the same time, we realize that it is an inevitable end, We only are stewards for these objects. And so the three big areas we explored this past year were, again, the diverse types of materials used in artist media. So again, the fibers and bindings and things that we'll look at shortly. But also how just by labeling different materials, you can actually prevent things from becoming waste. I couldn't help but notice that as I walked up the stairs today, there was a big table with books that said, free to take. If it didn't have that sign there, there's a good chance that those might end up in the trash. Last but not least, this idea of deaccessioning is scary to a lot of people, but also very fundamental to making sure that museums and archives don't grow like cancer, There needs to be some sort of interfacing with different groups across time. And the perspective that I brought to the Center for Book Arts was a little bit more of an engineering one, using green chemistry metrics like E-factor or process mass intensity to essentially measure and quantitate how sustainable an artist project might be. And so to give you a highlight of some of the materials in their collections, even though this isn't about literally transforming waste, Transforming Hate, an artist book by Clarissa Sly, is an exploration of how you turn hate material. This was from a white supremacist manual that was gifted to the artist that she then transformed into the beautiful paper cranes that you see here. If you know some of the history of paper cranes, it's generally said that if you create 1,000 of them, you're given a wish. And in many ways, this book, where she creates 1,000 paper cranes, is about transforming materials into something else. And so even though as a scientist I'm thinking about the literal atoms and molecules and their transformation, I appreciate that at a larger scale, people think about transformations and waste in really different ways. And so there's no better example than my favorite book in the collection, which is the New York Garbage Flag Profile. This book by Michaelis Pitchler was published in 2003, so just about 2 years after 9/11, where really across the world, along with the United States, the American flag was being flown everywhere. And so this is a documentation of materials that had been thrown out that had the American flag published on them. And I'm very grateful to say that we still are legally allowed to throw out or burn the American flag, at least at this moment. And so despite that, one of the things you'll know is that based on the US flag code, it is actually illegal to publish or print the flag on a piece or material that will be thrown out. So what this artist kind of creatively did was take a photo of wherever he found an American flag on something that was disposed of, and then he actually removes the item. So it's sort of like a peekaboo book you might remember from when you were a kid. Right at the top, you see it. In the second item, you see that it's gone. But what's fascinating in the other images on the far right is that sometimes you can't even really tell where the item has gone. And so in this case, we can actually see the very same type of pizza box that was in the image I showed you at front. Right? The listing, which is kind of hard to read on the yellow cover, is that same listing of possible toppings, right, that you probably chose from earlier today. And so again, artists are thinking about waste as content, thinking about waste as materials. But what we did was a trash audit. So let me ask, who here has ever done a trash audit before? Very cool. So this is commonly done in, say, environmental science settings, where you could literally go through the garbage in a certain environment to see what people are throwing out. And so what the volunteers and I did at the Center for Book Arts was go through the rubbish bins, of course with gloves, and really determine what types of materials were commonly being used so that we could then start to think about how we repurpose, right, these different sorts of materials. And so it's no surprise that we found things like papers and plastics, a variety of different fibers and inks and glues. Part of our talk today is about the binders that, right, adhere the different cellulosic materials. But I think my favorite components that we found were the Capri Sun and the other things on the far right, which more than anything are evidence of the practice, right, rather than the object itself, reminding us that waste is fundamental to creation, right? You can't get away from it, so you have to think better about how you might address it. And so after we collected these items from the Center for Book Arts, I took them back down the street to the science lab at FIT. On the right-hand side, you can see IR curves, so infrared spectrometry curves of the different materials. Now, of course, scraps that you find in the bin aren't always labeled. And so in this case, IR spec allows artists and scientists a very easy way to determine what these materials are made of, and then, of course, how they could be repurposed or reused. It offers much more information than that about intermolecular bonds and whatnot. But in this case, you can even see that the ink on paper, or in this case, the ink on plastic, shows very different features, and you might be able to select which of these are recyclable based on, right, the chemical and materials in them, really only revealed using something like IR spec. Now, I will take a moment to point out the kind of pink curve in the center, which is ink on plastic. Rizzo is a technique commonly used for making zines, and it typically uses a soybean oil-based ink. And so this is an example of where artists are already being more sustainable, right, using natural materials to create functional media. But with that said, I wanted to think about how we could also exploit some of the common oils that we find in our kitchens and, of course, our restaurants and across our world. And so if you don't know, fat has many different functions. It is really nature's carbon storage in some sense. One of the things we're desperately trying to do across our planet is stop carbon from entering our atmosphere in the form of CO2. And so one of the best ways we can store it, at least in organic media, is in fats and oils. Now, you can choose to store that in your body or other places as well. But in this case, we want to prevent it from entering environments where it can become a problem. So I am really glad that this is not my photograph on the right. I have been told that fatbergs, which collect and accumulate as oils in sewer systems, are about the most foul-smelling things on Earth, because it's not just oils, right? It's skin and hair and all that other kind of waste. And so if you didn't already know, we never pour edible oils down the drain. I won't make you out yourself, but does anybody collect their oils in a separate container and throw them out properly? If you don't, we'll talk about this later. Leave it to be said, again, as a materials chemist, there are creative ways to capture carbon from our atmosphere, but instead I was way more interested in thinking about how we could store them in functional chemicals and different materials. So on the bottom left here, you see pretty much the 5 oils I keep in my kitchen at any time. Things like oil blends, coconut oils, soybean oils, essentially showing the diversity of oils across our planet. If you squeeze most living things, you get oil. And so we need diverse strategies for, right, working with these different kinds of oils. And so that's what we did. This was actually work done by undergraduates at Manhattan College. They were creating really just a stock soap gel solution. Can anybody guess when this project was done? When did we need soap the most in the last decade? Surprise, surprise. It was during COVID, right? When we needed not only safe and accessible materials, but one of the things I hated the most during COVID was when you went to wash your hands and there was this really grody or gross soap container that was leaking or dripping. And so one of our goals here was to take our liquid oils and liquid soaps and turn them into sort of viscoelastic gels. This is one of the things we often do in material science, is kind of straddle between different phases or materials. One of the great things about gels like these are they are viscoelastic and can be liquid when you want or solid when you need. So they don't spill until you need them to. And on the right-hand side, what we begin to see is that you can actually transform a single feedstock, like these oil-derived soaps, into a variety of different materials. So who here has ever banged on a ketchup bottle trying to get the ketchup out onto their fries? Right, that's a shear thinning example where things become more viscous. Alternatively, if you've ever seen the cornstarch on the speaker, that oobleck example where things become more solid as you apply shear, we found that by changing the concentration of glycerol alone, a natural component found in our bodies and also many consumer products, that you could make a variety of different shear thinning and thickening materials. So really showing, again, the diversity of these bio-based and waste-based resources in a variety of different settings. So even though soap is important and we use it every day, in this case, one of the more recent projects at FIT is exploiting some of these, again, agricultural products we find across the United States. Now, I will admit, I feel really bad for US soy at the moment. This is probably a couple weeks old now, but they've been having a really difficult time selling their soybeans and feedstocks. So even though the US soy has a variety of different outlets, one of the activities we've been working on is creating bio-based and waste oil-based epoxy adhesives, which could also make their way back to places like the Center for Book Arts. Right? Artists could use not only natural materials made from renewable resources, but use materials that purposefully break down rather than exist forever. And so there's a lot of chemistry here that I'll kind of gloss over, but there are many different ways to transform these double bonds that we talked about before. You can use harsh methods like ozone, which purposefully sever these bonds, like we saw with our vanillin. Alternatively, you can use milder methods like peracid methods or even oxone to essentially create epoxides, which are then further transformed into these epoxy glues and resins. And so one of my challenges is always bringing these chemical technologies to the everyday person. We were able to create waste oil-derived epoxies in our lab that we could then bring to the artists just down the street. So these were from cooking oils that we had used in our kitchen, ones that we had brought into the lab, and then finally into the artist studio. But the goal of this project was actually one step beyond that. As was mentioned in the introduction, a lot of my work is bringing life cycle thinking and techniques and also techno-economic assessments into the classroom. I cannot tell you how difficult that is to do in a single semester with art students. But one of my favorite things is showing students the reality of the kinds of stuff they work with. So on the right-hand side, you'll see where we really bridge the science that I do and the kind of business math that my students do year by year. This was about determining how long it would take to recoup an investment if you were going to try to manufacture this waste-based epoxy. Now, if my students worked for 44 days nonstop, they would be able to make their money back. Obviously, there are labor laws and other things that prevent students from doing that. But more than anything, this is the beginning of them realizing that we need innovative solutions, right, to make things commercial and sustainable. Earlier today, I've talked with a couple of your colleagues about design projects on campus and how hard it is to go from an idea to reality. And part of that process is using life cycle assessments, techno-economic assessments. That was probably a whole PhD about 5 years ago. And these days, you might do multiple assessments in a single study. And so the last thing that I left at the Center for Book Arts was essentially some tools that they could use. And there's no better hierarchy in this case than the waste management hierarchy we see here. One of the things I always remind students is that reduce, reuse, recycle is done in that order. Right? It's always better to reduce waste than it is to recycle waste after it's been made. And so even though it is most important to prevent materials from becoming waste, maybe just by labeling them before you put them on the curb, there are proper times where you have to dispose of things as well, right? Again, as a hoarder at home, not an actual hoarder, just a kind of book hoarder, at the end of the day, there's times things go in the trash bin. And so this was one of my favorite kind of collaborations across the arts and sciences. But we have one more short story to tell, in this case, about how we bring things into the classroom. And so as I mentioned, one of my bread and butter practices is using the waste management hierarchy as we see here. But I can't help but notice that across education and pedagogy, we generally use what's known as Bloom's taxonomy. And I would argue that going across your undergraduate degree or even your graduate degree, you're working your way up the taxonomy, right? Going from basic memorization to eventually creation and dissemination in different ways. And so by kind of connecting these different ideas, students really learn skills rather than just facts about how to make things more sustainable. And so with my cosmetics and fragrance marketing students, we go back to the very beginning, right? Pigments have been used for many, many millennia to record human thought, to keep us safe and sustainable. Iron-based pigments have been used to create the images you see on the top left. I was reminded by an art historian that we have absolutely no understanding as to why they did this. This could have been for enjoyment. This could have been for religion or something else. But the important part is we still use these same pigments today. I would argue that some of us have these in our bodies right now as a byproduct of the things we consume. Some of us may even have them on our cheeks, right, in the blushes or rouges that we use for cosmetics. One of my favorite things about iron, other than it allows me to breathe, is of course that you can create a wide variety of different colors based on its oxidation state. That's really its versatility in some sense. And so again, everything old is new, not only in the sense that we're using historic materials, but we're also using historic practices in some sense. And so this project was really motivated by what you see on the right. I don't know if you have this at Yale, I would hope you don't, but towards the end of the semester, there are trash heaps, a mile high of the IKEA furniture that's being thrown out. And so one of the things my colleagues and I often try to do is recover materials as safely as we can. But we started to think about how we might be able to use waste from this student move out to actually create things that they'd use in the lab and at school. And the material we settled on was actually derived from Isaac Newton's recipe for an excellent ink. So before you could go down to the art supply store and buy pre-made materials, writing ink was often made at the station. You would mix something like an iron-based solution like ferrous sulfate with something like an extract of tannins from oak galls to create something that you would use that day. In this case, this kind of ink has been used also for about 1,000 years in the Declaration of Independence and many other sort of invisible inks as well. But this can be made from waste. You can take the kind of scrap metal that you find in your student waste, and then also take some of those leaves that you collect in the fall and bring them together. The other thing I really appreciate about this from a systems thinking perspective is it's really the amalgamation of the bio and techno into one. You have the organic from the tannins, you have the metal from the sort of e-waste, and you can bring them together in different ways. And so this is actually my favorite demonstration that I do with my students. FIT students don't like to touch grass. They are very much screen watchers and fabric sewers indoors. But I give an extra credit assignment every year where they have to go to Central Park and collect leaves that we then steep for tannins. On the other end, it is not difficult to find rusty iron metal in New York City. It seems to be everywhere these days. So by digesting that in a little bit of vinegar, we have, again, the sort of waste-based versions of those iron gall inks that we saw before. Now, even though these are typically used for writing, as you can see in the image in the center, they also create really beautiful tie-dye colors and patterns. And I would say the ultimate beauty of these materials is not that you get the same black every time, but rather that based on where you get your tannins, like for example, the acorn versus the cupule at the top of the acorn, you can actually get a variety of different colors. If you haven't gotten a sense of it, one of the goals of waste-based media is to show the versatility beyond just getting that same reliable product, something the artists really appreciated. And so it's no surprise that we're not just making materials, we have to study and evaluate them as well. One of the things my students do, I would say they do better than me, is understand about the applications of art media. So I'm the kind of person, when I walk down the aisles of Blick Art Supply, I'm looking at color, but my students are really interested in how things adhere to the page, how they dry quickly. The left-handed students are always complaining about, all that ink on their hand if it doesn't get there quickly enough. And so my favorite part of this project is that after making those iron-based pigments, they can actually formulate an array of different art media for different kinds of applications. So again, giving them the tools to create rather than boxing them in with just one kind of product to use. And so here's an example of some of the tests that they're doing in the lab. This is iterative and cyclic in some sense. So you'll notice that in test 1 at the top left, not a very dark, it's not a very, right, useful ink in some sense. Over time, they're realizing that they can kind of change small things and create either smoother or perhaps even harder or more opaque inks for exactly what they need. These are not yet skin safe, but we could hope one day that my students also maybe create their own mascaras, right, or eyeliners that they could use in different ways. And so this is a mock-up of the process flow, some of the engineering ideas that I bring to my art students, thinking about how things connect and combine. But again, highlighting that you can make not only things like inks, but pigments and paints, all from the same waste-based materials, oak leaves and the rusted iron metal that we have at top. And then my students, again, are the creative ones. Slay was a word they had to teach me a couple years ago, but now I think I understand it. But they put it onto fabric for us. These are just some examples of the student designs. I will say marketing students are not design students. I have some very talented artists and sketchers in this current semester, but my favorite is the Live, Love, Laugh. We couldn't even afford a stencil with it in the right order. Leave it to be said, the dyes you're seeing on the fabric are natural. These are those tannins and iron-based solutions themselves. But again, then by combining them, you also get the inks and paints that you see on top. So again, very versatile materials for different kinds of applications and settings. And so here we are at the end of the talk for today, and I want to remind you that, no surprise, from renewable resources, mighty polymers grow. This is the idea that you can, again, make many different things from simple waste-based chemicals. Beauty, of course, is also in the eyes of the beholder. It takes different perspectives, artists, scientists, engineers, and educators to come together to revalue what is and isn't waste, right? Something that is waste to us is very valuable to someone else. And then I think I've said it too many times today, but everything old and useful is new again, in the sense that those sort of sustainable ideas from history are going to come back to us as our future solutions. And so I'll pause here also to point out that I'm excited to share my first book is going to hit the stores in a couple of months. So if you also use soap every day or agree that it is a valuable material, come check out How and Why Soap Works. This is essentially for budding scientists. So if you have nephews or nieces who are interested in sustainable chemistry, these are 30 experiments you can do at home. This includes some of the research-based work we've done making soaps from waste as well. And so without further ado, this work is not done in a silo. I have collaborators across the arts and sciences, as you can see here, and my wonderful students who really started this journey making the waste-based packaging materials, and always looking for new collaborations as well. You are all always invited to FIT. We have a Sustainable Business and Design Conference in just 2 weeks. You're welcome to come into. And without further ado, I think we're right on time and have some room for questions. Any questions?
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I'm curious, what do you think? I'm just trying to imagine like in the world, like maybe in 20 years or 30 years later, where this sort of great work could be done in a larger scale. I'm just wondering what would the steps needed to create that environment? Would it more like be some sort of a financial structure that could potentially be a fine on waste that it's harder to throw out stuff in the future? Or just curious about like what are potential ways to reach that step? Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely. So about making this more global in scale or broader. You know, ironically, the thing I think about a lot is how local things need to be sustainable. So obviously, renewable feedstocks differ based on what continent you're on or even what region of a country you're in. And so I think about it, even though it is about growing the scale, about making things a little more micro and accessible based on where you are. One of the things I like about the tannin work is that 95% of college campuses have squirrels and oak trees. So that's a demo almost anyone can do. But of course, there's regions across this planet where you might not have oak trees to get your tannins from. And so ironically, I think to grow the scale of some of this work, it's actually more about bringing it to home. And one of the first things I try to have my students do is think about not only what wastes they're making, but what other wastes are in their local region. Like one of the things that often comes up when I mention tannins, students love going to the Mexican restaurants in New York City and getting the avocado like shells and peels, right? Because they often are in a big heap at the back of the store. More realistically and kind of towards your point, pilot plants are always needed in between small and large scale chemical innovations, and that's always about funding. So the biggest challenge I would say is the diversity of waste resources, right? Garbage is literally complex. And just like we have with our recycling bins outside, making sure that things get kind of sorted before they go in there. Yeah.
Thank you for that really awesome presentation. That was a fun walk through. The fun thing that comes to my mind, obviously, is sort of the idea of circular economy, and I'm sure you're talking about that in your classes. But I mean, that seems to be the thread almost, right? Do you also do anything around the question of end of life? So you're doing a lot on making things out of waste.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any work on trying to design things to break down? You kind of touched upon this, but maybe as a question.
Yeah, so as Hanno points out, just because something is made with bio-based materials doesn't mean it is going to break down, right? You can make a durable plastic resin, like I was talking about. Part of our challenges at FIT is we don't have some of the, say, like areas to compost that you might need to see if things biodegrade. So we are always looking for, environmental scientists and toxicologists to work with in that sense. But one of the biomaterials library projects we have at FIT is actually partnering with our dye garden. And so they're actually taking their waste, like scraps from the unfinished products, and putting them into the composter as well. Now, as you well know, there's a lot of rigorous methods you need to prove if something's biodegradable. So yeah, I would say it's not just about where things come from, but also where things go. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a great talk. I'm especially interested in your journey towards pedagogy.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how vaguely to pitch this, but as you develop curricula for non-specialists, trying to teach them something they need to know as a practitioner, what are some of the lessons you've learned about how to do that process?
That's a good question. So I will say that the soy-based work we did was a really interdisciplinary team. With AI these days, it's easy for me to say what would be the cost of this ingredient to do a calculation. But we had partnered with consultants and business specialists who were going into databases of their own and really selecting not only relevant but accurate data. So it's no surprise that collaboration is going to be my answer, even though you might think you just need skilled educators, right? A lot of the work we do today is so interdisciplinary. I mean, again, thinking about the business information that goes into this, but also, again, the marketing stuff. So my students inspire me because they not only suggest to R&D what might be formulated for a cosmetic product, but they are a gatekeeper in some ways as to whether a truly green or sustainable product will even be marketed as such, right? So in many ways, it's about having multiple seats at the table and knowing your audience. Again, I foolishly thought that all my students were artists when I joined FIT, and I realized that it's very different to work with artists versus, again, business students. And so thinking about who you're talking to is a big part of it. Yeah.
We have time for one more question before we wrap up, but everyone is invited to continue the conversation with Dr. Silverman in the dean's office immediately following this, if you're interested in more one-on-one question time.
Well, if no one has a question, we'll thank Dr. Silverman again.
Thank you.
And like Lori said, we are going to be continuing the conversation with a coffee chat down in the dean's office. So everyone and anyone is welcome for that.
Thanks, Julian. Yeah.
I have to run to go teach.
Sounds good. Have a good class. I'm following. Is it Lori?
Yeah, Lori will take.
Lori. Awesome.
And then, so your meetings with